This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we got a special guest on the podcast today. Her name is Nicole Wilke. So she is a child welfare researcher, missionary, author, and marriage and family therapist. And she currently serves as the director of the Center of Applied Research for Vulnerable Children and Families, bridging research and practice to improve faith-based care for vulnerable children and families around the globe. So her and her family currently reside in Peru, where her and her husband do a lot of different ministry work there. And they are really overall just trying to improve the nationwide system for children in alternative care. And so I'm really excited to bring this conversation to you today, because every now and then I'll get a pitch for a book or for someone to come on the show, and I can't even remember why I originally wanted to have them on the show, but there is a single word that was in the subtitle of her book, which here's her book right here, guys. You can check it out in the show notes. The book is called Overcoming. Okay, great. I like overcoming, overcomers. But here's the subtitle: What Scripture and Science Say About Resilience. And if you know anything about me, anything about this ministry, anything about the show, you know I talk about resilience all the time. We're here to equip men to push back darkness. How do we do that? By helping you forge spiritual, mental, physical resilience, right? And so I knew I wanted to get into this, but specifically today, I know we talk a lot about you guys being resilient, right? And I know we have about 5% of our listeners are ladies, and a lot of y'all are working on your own personal resilience and the resilience of your families. But this conversation is going to be like, okay, how can we take those things that we're learning about resilience personally and apply that to our children? How do we have resilient kids? Because look, she had a rough upbringing, Nicole did. Okay, so she was one of 11 kids. She had 70 foster siblings. She had some early real trauma in her life. And so how was she able to look at those things appropriately and not be defined by them, but then, become an overcomer herself? But yeah, in this book, we talk about, what is resilience? Specifically, how do we approach resilience? And also, what is trauma? We live in a day where people are like, oh, somebody wrote my name down wrong on my Starbucks cup. And it's like, oh, that's a microaggression somehow. And now they've experienced trauma. And it just doesn't help us put things in the right categories. But we do talk about the differences between trauma and early adversity and normal stress. And then also the problems with being a snowplow parent, which some of you guys, you just got offended, which means you should listen to this episode. Because some of you guys, you're the snowplow in front of your kid, or some of you allow your wives, because they have a dominant personality, you allow them to do it. But that's another discussion, I guess, for another day. But you want to push all the problems out from in front of your kids. You don't want them to experience any adversity. You don't want them to ever be uncomfortable, to ever be hot or cold or tired or disappointed, and how that doesn't lead to overall strong and resilient kids. It doesn't lead to kids who have an overcomer's mindset. It leads to kids that are looking around waiting for mommy or daddy or some other authority figure to help them out and keep them from experiencing any discomfort. But then we just get into this overall idea about how having particular strategic relationships in our lives, that those help us build resilience. And we got really practical at different points about, okay, well, how does this apply to our kids? How can we make sure that we have resilient kids? So a lot of dads and some moms in this audience, guys, if you have kids and you want them to be resilient, this is one you need to listen to. So without further ado, let's get into it. Nicole Wilke, welcome to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast.
Hey, well, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you. I'm really excited to get into your book, but you've told me off air that you don't have the best internet in the world, and it's because you're not here in America, right? Where there's never any internet problems, even though I'm like the number one cause of internet problems apparently in my entire neighborhood. That's a story for another day. But what the heck are you doing in Peru?
Yeah, well, my family and I live here. My husband leads a coalition of churches and faith-based nonprofits who are changing the system for care for vulnerable children.
Okay, and so I've heard your husband's also a fan of Undaunted.Life, so shout out to Mr. Wilke. We're a big fan of you now as well. But it's interesting for me because obviously you can see what someone's doing like right now in their life, whatever it is, in terms of if they're volunteering or their profession. Sometimes it can tie all the way back to stuff that they experienced in their childhood and how that impacts things. And there's actually a quote from your book, which we'll get to in it. Well, I might as well go and introduce it, but then we're going to get into it. It's called Overcoming: What Scripture and Science Say About Resilience. But there's a quote that I thought was apropos to kind of talk about who the heck you are. It says, I, Nicole, was raised in a foster and adoptive family. There are 11 of us kids now, 11, and I've had over 70 foster siblings in my lifetime. Despite multiple advanced degrees, growing up among siblings who experience early adversity has been the most demanding and educational experience of my life so far. I had a front row seat to the consequences of hardship and the glories of resilience. People will be like, wait a minute, that doesn't fit, but don't worry, guys, we will get there. But for you, talk about growing up, Nicole.
Yeah, well, I feel blessed to have had a very atypical childhood, one that I can look back on. And although I think the current cultural trend is to say like, oh, I just had the worst childhood growing up, and some people genuinely did. I didn't. I had lots of hardship in my life and lots of, exposure to the very dark things of this world. But I also had parents that loved me. I knew the Lord from a young age, and I knew this was part of our family's calling. And I now believe it's part of our family's generational calling to be part of caring for vulnerable children and families. And that's what the Lord has done in my life. Seeing that growing up and then seeing it professionally as I've become a clinician and now I work in research and for the Christian Alliance for Orphans, I have seen time and again, both through other people, professionally and personally, and even in my own adversity and trauma, that God can take what the enemy means for evil and use it for good. And that we can hold the dual truths of simultaneously saying, hey, this was not the way that it was supposed to be. This is not God's original design. We're not talking Garden of Eden stuff here. And simultaneous to that, we can lament that, we can grieve that, and we can know that God can take this horrible situation and he's going to use it for our good and his glory. And for me, that's tremendously hopeful.
Well, Nicole, I've been reliably informed that if you've experienced any type of trauma or if anything bad has happened to you, that is now your identity, and that also is currency in our modern culture. Because if you live in a victimhood culture, which is the modern West, capital W West, if you are a victim, then you have cards to play. Whereas before, it was like, well, if you were a victim of something, we only gave you cards if you overcame that. I mean, no pun intended with the name of the book, but we don't live in an overcomer culture now where we value overcomers, where the heroes of the movie or the book are the people that overcome. We're still drawn to those stories, but culturally, as it pertains to things that aren't happening in the Marvel universe, it's your trauma. That's what defines you. It's your ailment. We literally make up ailments out of thin air. So one, we can, prescribe you pills and make money. And number two, so that we can analyze every part of you. Now it's called clinical depression, whereas 100 years ago it was just melancholy. And it was like, okay, there are some things here that I think are important to discuss, but the ultimate, vision was not navel gazing. It was, this sucks, but do you want to get over it or do you want to wallow in it? Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally does. And I would say for me, I think there are genuine situations in which people need extra support. There's no question about that. But it's so societally different. If you look 100 years ago, this is one interesting example that I think might resonate with you all. In the military, guys are seeing absolutely horrific stuff, right? Absolutely horrific stuff. But it's really interesting because there was a time in which you would have this sort of buffer zone between being in a war. You would get on a ship. And so it might take anywhere from a month to 3 months to get back to your home. And you've got this space to consider and a buffer space to process and overcome and move to your next phase.
Right.
Now we live in this era where things are rapidly changing and super quick and people are trying to turn on a dime. And I think what's happening there is we're not being given the space to recognize adversity as normative. This, in fact, is going to happen to every single person. And that was understood back in the day, right? Whether you were in the military, whether you were experiencing, extreme illness, injury, even really hard things like domestic violence. Everyone was going to experience something really difficult. Everyone knew that. That was normal. And certainly there are situations of extreme cases that this would probably not apply to. Okay. And we can talk about those at a later juncture. But for the most part, I think what has happened now is there is this culture where it's often called collective trauma. So we go through a hard thing like the pandemic, it's collective trauma. And for me, as somebody who works with, children who have experienced abuse, neglect, violence, and exploitation, I think it's important to distinguish that there's a different definition of trauma here. I'm not saying it's not difficult. I'm not saying it's not adversity. It certainly is. But that doesn't mean that everyone is going to have long-term symptoms and negative effects. And instead, I think we're missing this piece of the community coming alongside, collectively recognizing that we can go through difficult things and and that does not lower the ceiling on your future potential. This does not define your life. There's so much more to you.
One, we're going to get into trauma here in a second because you're hitting on some stuff that I really do want to get into because there's no, okay, maybe I'll get into it a little bit now, but then I'll put it back in the bottle and then we'll let it out again later. But it's like, okay, in terms of my background, I like Celtic origin, so that's Irish and Scottish, which is very apparent by anyone that looks at me. And then there's also Choctaw Indian. And so, the Celtic peoples were not treated very well by the English and things like that. And Choctaws, we enslaved and we were enslaved and we were enslavers, right? We murdered people and raided people and raped people and all those types of things. And those same things happened to my people. I feel no connection to those events because I'm not there. I wasn't there. I didn't experience those events. Those things didn't happen to me. So I don't have this generational trauma. But you said something earlier, Nicole, where you talked about you specifically having a generational calling. We seem to be pulled culturally towards the generational hurt and generational stuff. And, this thing happened to my great-great-grandfather, so somehow I'm owed something by society or something else. And it's like, okay, calling looks forward and the generational trauma looks way backwards. And so talk a little bit more about you specifically, generational calling, and how that's a better way to really think overall.
Well, when we think about resilience, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but we require something called protective factors to help us to be overcomers. And there's a lot of things that can be protective factors, but there's kind of a category of them that clusters around things like future optimism for the future, or having a vision, or considering things long term, right? And this makes sense, right? Because if you're in survival mode and you're like only looking at today or maybe this minute, it's very difficult to get out of that cycle and that pattern. But when we're able to set our sights and help our children and the generations of our family set their sights on long term, what is the story for our family? What is our contribution to building the kingdom, right? It is not about us as individuals. We in the West live in an individual society, but really this is about the church. This is about the body of Christ. And so when we see our family tucked up under that as a part of that, our family does have a specific calling. And for me personally, I think I just knew from a young age that my experiences were they were a stepping stone to something more. So I experienced my own situation of an extreme illness that left me bedridden for 2 years when I was in middle school, like the most awkward time of life, right? And I have this distinctive memory. We couldn't figure out what it was. It was super mysterious. In the end, it ended up that my appendix had burst and I was septic for 2 years and they just didn't find it. And I remember laying in bed one night, my mom's laying there with me and I'm, 13, 14, just ranting, like so upset about this. This is unfair, blah, blah, blah. And I remember her saying to me, I just need you to know that I'm listening to you now. And I trust and believe that God is going to use this story as ministry. And I was like, too cool to say it, right? But there was just this teeny tiny seed of an idea that made me think, maybe this is all worth something. And when you start to think about purpose and what it can be and how it can contribute, all of a sudden, it's not just a net loss, right? This can actually, God can take this thing that is no doubt something that I grieve, something that I lament, something that I suffer a lot of negative feelings over. He can take that and he can use it as a launch pad to something better long term. And that is what I hope to cultivate in generations of our family. My husband and I talk about this. Like, our kids are going to experience hard things. There's no question. This world isn't about to get easier, but they can be known. Our family could be known for being overcomers rather than being known for our future being dictated by our current circumstances.
Right. And as I say this, I know this is going to come off very self-helpy, but you get to define you. And so you are who God says you are. I think that's a great way to comport yourself and operate. But in terms of any past trauma or any past success, you get to define that. So I recently had a conversation with Wes Huff, and I can't remember if we said it during the interview or afterwards, but every time something cool happens for one of us, which for him, overnight, boom, in an instant, he became the most famous Christian apologist on planet Earth, perhaps ever, right? Maybe, other than C.S. Lewis. But anyway, he looks at that as an opportunity to go low. To come low, to humble himself because of the success he has. Why? Because what is the source of the success? Where do all good things come from? They come from the Lord. He didn't manifest those things. He didn't look in the mirror and give affirmations to himself, and that ended up giving him on the Joe Rogan Experience. No, but the same thing happens with any bad thing that has happened to us, whether we were a party to it or not. Because there are things, people are like, my favorite example is my pastor buddy, Joby Martin, says, he's like, people will come up to him and be like, Satan's attacking my finances. And then they'll describe what's going on. It's like, Satan's not attacking your finances. You're spending more than you make. You're a moron. Stop it. It's like, you're doing this to you, but sometimes you don't get to choose the life that you're leading. You don't get to choose what was in your past and all those things. And so let's go ahead and get into the book. Again, the name of the book is Overcoming What Scripture and Science Say About Resilience. So let's just start 30,000 foot, and then we'll delve in. Why this book? Why now? Why you? Why do it with a co-author who's Amanda Hiles Howard? So get into all that.
Yeah, well, Mandy and I have been working together about 7 years, and I knew she was just the gal for the job here. But for both of us, she's worked in research in this space and clinical work in this space. She's been a kinship care provider as well, and so have I. And, when we look at these things, we were seeing a very different reality than what was being communicated largely within kind of the child welfare field, if you will, or kind of in popular culture, right? We're hearing, if you experience hard things, that's bad for you. There's a limit on your potential. You're probably going to end up, homeless or committing suicide or in the criminal justice system. And the truth is, research does say that is more likely. But that's at a population level, meaning if you take a group of people who have experienced these hard things and you look at them 20, 30 years later, there's a higher likelihood. That's not looking at an individual and saying you will necessarily fulfill those outcomes. So there was a missing narrative in that as researchers, we were also in the research literature reading things around just kind of seeds of ideas around resilience and overcoming. And we were seeing this constantly. Kids who should not succeed were, in the Paralympics and were starting nonprofits and were living these amazing lives. So what is this common denominator? And we believe that resilience is a big part of it. So for us, we're bringing both that personal and that professional perspective. But what we really wanted to do was boil down what science says, which interestingly, like every single time, good science is going to confirm the truth of scripture, right? And we're seeing this thread tying together the truth of scripture, things like we're seeing horrible trauma in scripture. There's no question. There are a lot of traumatic things, but we're also seeing God has a plan for you. He's created good works for you. He's made you to be an overcomer. And then within the science, we're seeing things like different characteristics, different mindsets, different behaviors that make it more likely that you will have positive outcomes long-term despite your early adversity. So that's the encapsulation that is in this book. And then we just get super practical. Half of the book is just straight up like, do this, not that. Because I think most parents, most caregivers, they don't want to read the research. Like they're like, tell me what to do and how to do it better. I'm trying to meet too many needs with too few resources. And so our hope is just to kind of cut to the chase there.
You really do cut to the chase, and that's apparent in the book because, I'm a very slow reader. It's just, I talk twice as fast as I read. I can't get those things to be simpatico, but I dusted this book off in an afternoon because you really just kind of get to the point. And so some people love to meander. Like I love Jordan Peterson. I love his writings, but sometimes in a chapter, you're like, I don't know where we are. I don't know where we're going. And I can't remember where we've been, but somehow by the end of the chapter, he brings it all together. He's a super genius. But we've used the word resilience a lot in this conversation. And again, guys, if you've been listening to the show for any length of time, what are we here to do? equipment to push back darkness. How do we do that? By helping you forge spiritual, mental, and physical strength? Nope. Resilience. We focus on resilience. We are obsessed with resilience. But a lot of people don't talk about that. A lot of people don't know how to spell it. So, Nicole, you don't have to spell it in front of me because I don't know what everyone's spelling. Acumenus. It happens. We don't know how to spell anything or calculate anything anymore. We can't even remember phone numbers. But what is resilience? From a 30,000-foot perspective, let's stay there, and then we'll get even farther into it.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to keep it really short. Resilience is the ability to overcome obstacles and leave them, not just bounce back from them, but actually leave stronger and more capable.
We love that. We love that definition. For me, I typically have to elucidate it a little bit further. And this is how I explain it typically when I'm speaking live. I use it in an athletic frame. And I like to talk about things that guys really like watching strength feats. So strongman competitions. Yes. Hey, no one's been ever to ever pick up this stone before. And then one guy does it. Oh, everybody loses their minds.
Yes.
But it's like, Hafthor Bjornsson, I think, is the last man to win all three of the biggest strongman competitions in the same calendar year. He won the Arnold Classic, Europe's Strongest Man, and the World's Strongest Man. But the way I describe it is, hey guys, the morning after the World's Strongest Man competition, he's got the trophy in his hotel room, but when he wakes up, is he the strongest man in the world? No, he's not. Why? Because he's destroyed. His body is absolutely obliterated from multiple days of some of the most insane strength feats that athletes could ever possibly do. However, Hafthor Bjornsson is a resilient athlete. So give him a couple of weeks to stretch, ice bath, get some massages, kind of recover, and he will again be the strongest man in the world. But Father Time and gravity are completely undefeated. Men and women should know this by now. And so you will never be as strong as you were at some other point in your life. And yeah, dad strength's a thing, and some people experience strength gains in their 50s, and it's different. But you can be resilient until the moment you cross over to the other side. But we don't focus on resilience because, again, there's a quote from the book. I can't remember what chapter. Building resilience is about progress, not perfection. It seems like the pursuit of strength is about perfection because you have a number in mind of what you want to bench press or what you want to deadlift or how fast you want to run. And that's the perfect standard that you've set for yourself. But I tell guys, don't do that. Like, it's good to have goals and all that type of stuff, but it's those little incremental steps you make every day where you didn't want to work out, but you did. So your anterior mid-cingulate cortex is going to grow because you didn't want to do the thing. It's hard and you did the thing anyway. You didn't want to run the last sprint, but guess what? You ran it and you ran farther than you had originally planned because you realized that inner punk inside of you was trying to get you to be weak and you didn't. So just go even further with this concept of resilience and why it is a better pursuit than overall strength.
Oh, well, there's no question, because I would consider it like, really strength is like a snapshot. It's where you are in the moment, and you can lose your strength. You can't lose your resilience. Resilience is progressive over time. I'll take what you were saying around strength and physical strength. One of the things that we know about resilience is it's essentially like a formula. You need to have challenge, which can look like stress. It can look like adversity. It could even look like trauma. We're not like prescribing trauma, right? But you need something really difficult, and you need something called protective factors, which kind of set the environment, the mindset, and the circumstances for you to have the healthy effect from that difficult thing. It's very akin to lifting weights, right? You need the stress and the strain of the weights. If you go in and you lift the same exact amount of weight every single day for a year, it isn't going to have as much effect as if you have that progressive increase, right? And you need that challenge. You need that strain. And it actually breaks down the muscle fibers so that they can be built back up stronger, right? Now, what you can't do is if you're in an unhealthy situation, you're sick, you're weak, and you go in and you're like, I'm lifting 500 today. It's not going to go well for you, right? You do need those protective factors. You need somebody spotting you. You need the right equipment. You need, you can't do that with like sweaty hands and drop it all over yourself. So you have to have some of these things that help you, right? And that would be exactly the same with building resilience. I mean, you can build physical resilience, spiritual, as you're talking about, social resilience, emotional, cognitive resilience. But what you're doing is you're taking on challenges, and that is increasing your capacity to do progressively difficult things. Now, when we think about trauma and kind of the psychological side to this, here's the thing. Let me give you an example that we use in our real life. So, glory to God, my kids have not experienced trauma. I'm grateful for that. I don't take that for granted, given my life and my line of work. But as a family, as parents, my husband and I know that it's a priority. They need challenge to build their resilience. Otherwise, right. It's like, oh, well, this is hard. It's hard to do the dishes and it's hard to do my math and whatever. And we're not going to do that. So we climb mountains together as a family. And we do like one really large hike every year. Last year, we did a 15,200 foot summit, and it was a 5-day hike. Okay. So our kids they were 9 and 6, and then we had the baby. We didn't make her hike that. Okay. She rode a horse. But we're making them do strenuous things. And, we had an instance where we were at about 14.6, and our oldest slipped, and she scraped up her knee, and she said, "Oh, I don't want to continue." And I said, "Hey, babe, listen, I'm not going to make you continue. You can go on a horse if you want to, but I want you to understand that if you summit, you're going to say, 'I climbed a 15er.' And if you stop now, you're not saying that. I'm just like putting it out there for her. You need to make this decision. You've come all this way. You're almost there. And you won't be able to say that you've done it, right?" And she makes the decision, "No, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Of course I'm going to do it." And I'm like, okay, she just needed that gut check, right? But when we don't have adversity in our lives, we need to intentionally give ourselves progressive challenge, progressive stretching. It's that tearing down the muscle fibers and building them back up. But here's what I'll say. When we come home and she's doing her math facts, her division facts, and she says to me like, "Oh, that's hard." I'm like, "Excuse me? You just climbed a 15,000 foot mountain. I think you can handle this." And I know it, and she knows it, right? And so when we go through really difficult things and we overcome them, other things in light of that are less difficult. We know we've got what it takes, and we can cultivate that in our children as well. And I believe that has generational consequences for our family when we look something difficult in the face and we don't think, "Oh, it's going to eat me alive," but instead we think, "I have the resources, the support network, the relationship with the Lord that I'm going to get through this, and I'm going to come out the other side better."
Well, Nicole, everyone knows you get to choose your hard. And so if you don't take care of your body, you don't take fitness or your diet seriously, you're going to have some hard things that you have to deal with later in life, all things being equal. And guess what? If you live a very strict life with your diet and you take fitness seriously, you're going to have some hardness there. Like every time you train, it's going to be hard, but also, you're going to have some wear and tear. But one of my favorite Michael Jordan stories, don't worry, it'll all make sense, guys. One of my favorite stories that came from the Last Dance documentary was there was this famous story of a particular guy on a particular team on a particular night. I can't remember any of the circumstances, but Michael Jordan said that this guy said something to him like that was pretty bad, like some pretty bad trash talk. And then that guy, Michael Jordan just decided, "I'm going to go at this guy. I'm going to absolutely destroy him." And, famous game, scores a bunch of points, absolutely embarrasses the guy. Well, come to find out, the guy never said anything. Right? Michael Jordan made it up, right? And I'm not advocating for lying, guys, but Michael Jordan made up that this guy said this thing that gave him the edge. And so I am all for manifesting more hardness and difficulty. This is not going to make sense to well-adjusted people in this audience. So there's your PSA. But there have been several times, Nicole, before I put my hands on the barbell, whether it's for squat or deadlift or something like that, I'm like, all right, if you don't lift this, your whole family dies and you die in a fiery car crash. And people are like, you shouldn't motivate that way. I'm like, guys, it's not real. But for 10 seconds during the exercise, it's as real gets. Hey, if you don't get to that mailbox at full speed, your church is going to, be set on fire. Like, it's just any of those types of things. And I'm fully okay with manifesting some of those things. But I did actually want to ask you a question, because this is not indicative of a lot of guys in my audience, but there is kind of I want to keep talking about resilience and suffering. I want to keep talking about trauma, but I operate and I fuel with negativity. So I just kind of talked about it a little bit. Like that's negative stick, right? What if my family really was going to die if I didn't do this max deadlift, right? But there was a counselor buddy of mine, licensed family therapist. He was trying to make a point, Nicole, and he said, Kyle, you don't walk into every jiu-jitsu tournament assuming that you're just going to, get beat, do you? And I was like, well, yeah. That's exactly what I assume. I assume that the very first match, that not only is this guy going to break my arm, he's going to drag my unconscious corpse and drop it in front of my weeping mother. That's what I assume is going to happen. So I train and compete like a lunatic to make sure that that doesn't happen. And he's like, dude, that's insane. And I'm like, I don't disagree with you, but it's how I fuel. And I've had a lot of mentors that have expressed a lot of concern. They're like, Kyle, you can't fill your gas tank with that. But I'm like, it seems to be working like rocket fuel at this point. So what are your thoughts? What are your clinical thoughts on something like that? Because I know I'm not unique in my audience. There are a lot of guys that operate based on negative fuel.
It's interesting. There is actually research that essentially says somebody who has more anxious tendencies like that tends to be more successful long term. And I have my own anxious tendencies. So I read that and I thought, oh, great. This is another God taking what the enemy means for evil and using it for good, But I think there's a line, right? Where when we're using it in the context of this creates functionality, it can be really healthy. It can be valuable. When it gets to the point of, rumination or obsessive thoughts about that then we maybe need to think about talking to somebody to offer some support, or even just a different perspective. But I think that, again, this is a situation where we get to decide how we leverage this. It's all about leverage, right? It could be something that it's a boulder that rolls over you and kills you as it's rolling down the hill, or it could be something that you you use it for building something really important. And it's all about how you're going to shift your perspective, how you're going to put it to use, and then what guidelines and guardrails you put around it to make sure it doesn't get out of control. But I think that my cultural lens on this is that I think there are people that could be served well by being more motivated by potential consequences, because the truth is there are also legitimate situations in which we have these concerns, and we're preparing and we're planning. We're not just worrying about it, we're doing something about it. And so again, it comes down to functionality.
Hey guys, real quick. A consistent question that I am asked is, Kyle, what is your diet? People want to know if I'm tracking macros or if I'm doing keto or something like that, but I track one thing. I try to get 1 gram of high quality protein for every pound of body weight. And so for me, I eat red meat every single day. Pretty much for lunch, I eat a pound of red meat every single day to get over 100 grams of high quality protein. And guys, I want you to be able to get the same thing for you and your diet. That's why I want you to use the official beef delivery partner of Undaunted.Life, and that's Primal Beef. Primal Beef is a cattle operation owned and operated by Sean Glass. He's a retired Navy SEAL that partnered with Jocko Willink, yes, that Jocko Willink, to launch Primal Beef. So what makes Primal Beef different from the other beef delivery companies? It's a combo of the following. It's all American Black Angus cattle. The beef comes from one farm, and that's in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The beef is all natural, no hormones ever, no antibiotics ever, no mRNA ever. After slaughter, the entire carcass is dry aged and then hand cut by artisan butchers and then flash frozen to ensure that it maintains tenderness, marbling, and flavor. And here's another cool thing. For every box sold, Primal Beef donates meat directly to a member of America's Special Operations Forces through the C4 Foundation. So you can take pride in knowing that your purchase will help put literal food on the table for America's finest warriors. Are you salivating yet? If not, it's probably because you're a vegan. Stave off veganism and try Primal Beef out today by going to www.primalbeef.com. That's primalbeef.com. Use the promo code Kyle to get $25 off of your first order. Again, that's primalbeef.com, promo code Kyle to get $25 off your first order. Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, guys, you're right to say that there is a line, because what I've noticed, because I've got a almost 5-year-old and an almost 3-year-old, is some of that negativity and some of that negative juice rolls over onto the boys. And I don't want to force that on them, because I'm kind of I feel like it was forced on me a little bit. Now I'm choosing to use it whenever there is other fuel available. But that doesn't mean that James and Eli need to fuel in the same way. And I'm also not going to be the one that say that this is healthy for the majority of people. I just think I'm wired a little bit different, right? We're gingers anyway. We don't have souls, so we're going to be different from the beginning. But then there are some things that go even further than that. But I want to back up and let's talk about trauma some more. So there's a quote from the book here that I want to get into. In the past, the word trauma was typically used as a description. It conveyed that a person had experienced something very painful. Today, quote unquote, trauma is often applied as if it were a diagnosis. At times, it has even grown into a destiny, a label guaranteeing a dismal future. Okay, so there are some very important words there. Description, right? Now it's diagnosis, and then it's destiny and future. And so let's talk a little bit more about, because there is a difference between trauma, early adversity, normal stress. You go into that in the book. There are differences for those categories. But I feel like we've removed all the separations for the different categories. And it's like someone asked me where I was from because they didn't recognize my accent. Microaggression, that person was racist. I'm a victim. And then we also have this person that's like, oh, I stubbed my toe when I was 5. And look, there's wisdom in the statement. The worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. So, in my childhood, my parents got divorced when I was 13. That was terrible. Other people I grew up with, they were raped by their uncle when they were 5. Okay, not the same level of trauma, but the worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And so talk a little bit more about how to delineate between real trauma. And again, I want to be very careful because it feels very real to you, but categorically it may be outside of what you're describing, but real trauma, early adversity, and just normal stress.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is such an important conversation. I don't claim to have all the answers, but everyone's going to experience stress, normal stress, right? Difficult things, stubbing your toe. Yep. There's positive stress like scoring a goal or giving a speech or, asking somebody out. There's negative stress like experiencing bullying, experiencing health issues, injuries, things like that. We then get to adversity. Adversity requires a child, when it's early adversity, it requires a child to respond in a way that isn't developmentally appropriate. So example is divorce. You're having to navigate things that a 13-year-old really isn't intended to navigate. So that's an adversity. And adversity is always objectively identifiable. So we can see it, we can know it. It is obvious. Now, it might be in secret, right? But something has happened. And if you tell this thing to somebody, they're going to say, oh, yes, I can understand what that is. Trauma is a little different. Trauma requires both adversity and then the perception of threat. So this could be anything from, like we were talking about earlier, military situations. It can be situations of violence, abuse, neglect. It can even be things where if a child sees their mother, their primary caregiver, and experiencing domestic violence or something like that, and they believe that she is at risk, life or limb, they can experience trauma from that as well. But usually there's this perception of threat to my well-being. And it is an instantaneous perception. So you can't go up to somebody who's just experienced something really hard and say, hey, it's not that bad, and just convince them to not be traumatized, right? That being said, in our society, it's been, number one, extremely overused. I went to my favorite restaurant and they didn't have my favorite meal and now I'm traumatized. I'm sorry, that is not trauma. Okay. It's become very common in our lexicon. It is also often looked at as though it is the defining characteristic of your life. Can you imagine this? Like, imagine you're a child and you're in a family, school setting, church setting, whatever, and what people know about you, what they believe about you, what they think about you when they think about your name or your face is that you experience trauma. How horrible would that be? That's like the only thing that you're known as. And increasingly, that is becoming common, that my trauma defines me. And that is so contrary to what scripture and science say. We look at the Bible, we see that Joseph and Daniel and David and on and on and on experience these really challenging things. These things where they're crying out to the Lord. They have no other support. there is no hope by human standards, right? And yet God took what the enemy meant for evil, and used it for good. And I think, going back to this idea of a destiny, trauma, we describe an experience. Trauma is a response, an instantaneous response to a horrible experience. And it could look different for different people, right? Somebody might experience a car accident. You've got two people that experience a car accident. One is traumatized. One is like totally able to move on. That being said, consider it more like an injury than an illness. Okay. This doesn't need to be something that determines the course of your life, rather something that we can heal from. And of course, when a child is experiencing trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, we need to step in. We don't just, it's not like when my toddler like eats dirt and I go, she's building her immunity or whatever. Like we do need to step in. And like to men, man, we need you to use your like protective warrior side that I know is not always celebrated. Like I'm celebrating that in the space of caring for kids. Like men are needed to do that. And we don't want to give kids the impression, even if they need to be removed from their families or we need to step in and support them. We don't need to protect them from everything in their lives forever, right? We're protecting them from those things that are harmful, not those things that are hard. Right. And there's a distinctive difference.
Okay, let's dig into there because I really want to get into that next. But as you were talking, even just recently I saw something in terms of, there's hormones and all kind of neurology behind it. But when there's been research done, when a baby cries in the middle of the night, the odds of mom waking up are way higher than the odds of dad waking up. Dad can sleep right through it. But totally. If there's a bump in the night, if there's a leaf that moves, 100 yards away outside, the man will wake up and the woman doesn't. Why? Because women are more naturally nurturing and men are more naturally protective, right? If things are all in the right order. And as you were describing everything you were just talking about there, Nicole, I was thinking about Yeonmi Park. And so like, yes, is she known as the gal who escaped North Korea, right? So she lived under that terrible regime and she ended up escaping. Yeah. But if you read her book and if you listen to her talk, it's one of the most impactful interviews we've ever had in the history of this podcast. It's like she at one point was walking across, it was a desert, but there was like a snowstorm. She's like in a light jacket and crappy shoes, and she's walking to just have the chance to get, through this country so that she can eventually get to South Korea, so that she could eventually maybe even make it to America. And here she is going to NYU eventually in America, and she's talking to some of her classmates who are experiencing relationship issues, or they have daddy issues or something, and they're paying thousands of dollars to go see these, fancy professional, therapists and things like that. And she's like, she would go out into the field to try to find crickets to, put over a fire to eat, to get a little bit of protein. She weighs about 85 pounds, and that's all she'll ever weigh because of the malnutrition she experienced growing up in North Korea. And these people are sitting there drinking $7 lattes, and, they're about to go get in their Range Rover to drive to their next appointment, and they're talking about their trauma. Now, again, you could have nice things and still have experienced legitimate trauma. I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's like, guys, we've got to really understand what type of things that we're experiencing. But that gets into this conversation that you teed up about, I would say, adversity and snowplow parents. So everyone has kind of heard about the helicopter parents. So the parent, they're kind of hovering around the kid like, oh, let's make sure things don't happen. But I remember this distinctly. I used to work at a university, the university I graduated from. I worked in the president's office of that university. And that's when I first felt like I experienced snowplow parenting. We had someone that called the office. They called the front desk. This person on the other line is demanding to speak to the president of the university. And it's like, well, we have like 3 layers of assistance to make sure that something like that never happens. Like, no, they don't need the president. But the person's, banging on the table like, I want to talk to him. I'm not going to talk to you, blah, blah, blah. And so we had told them like, look, you're a student worker. You don't get paid enough to do this. Like, give the phone call to us. And so we take on the phone call, and this person is demanding to speak to the president. We finally ask why. They said, my kid got a parking ticket. It's like, okay, well, have you talked to anyone in the parking department? And they're like, well, no. And then it was actually my coworker that said this, and it was brilliant. This was at the time when Steve Jobs was alive and iPods were still a thing. He's like, ma'am, do you have an iPod? And she's so confused. She's like, what are you talking about? He's like, if you had a problem with your iPod, would you call Apple and demand to speak to Steve Jobs? Is that something that you would do? Or would you work with someone else that could maybe help you? But ultimately, their kid knowingly parked in the wrong parking lot. They didn't have the right badge. They were late for class, which was also their fault. And now the parent is calling, demanding that this be taken off of their kid's bursar account so that they can enroll next semester. And it's like, look, we're not going to do that. So that's, guys, if you've never heard of snowplow parenting, that's what that is. You are the snowplow in front of your kid and you're taking everything that could possibly happen away from your kids. So short quote from the book, and then I want to get your feedback. Adversity can become a minor footnote amidst an epic novel that is the story God has for your child. But Nicole, a lot of parents are taking away the opportunity for overcoming from their kids by being a snowplow. Ready, set, go.
Yeah. Okay. So many thoughts on that. And I want to start with something that is in the book. We talk about the Yerkes-Dodson model, which is essentially a half circle. And on opposite ends, you'll see people who have too little stress or too much stress in their life. They're going to achieve very little. And those who achieve the most tend to have a certain amount of stress and adversity in their life. Now, if you're experiencing extreme trauma all the time, if you're, living in a war as a child or in an extremely abusive situation, obviously those situations come with consequences. Unlikely to be super successful. But if you're over here and you're not actually able to call the parking office and say, sir, why did I get this? Oh, how can I pay for this? Because I have a consequence. You're not going to be successful. So we as parents have an indelible role. We have a high and holy calling to empower our children to be successful in this world and to fulfill the role God has for them. And, it's interesting. I'll share a little story here. I was sharing with a group of people in the orphan care space. They care for vulnerable kids. And I shared about this. And this mom comes up to me and she says, I've adopted 6 teenagers from horrible situations. They all experienced horrible trauma. And I've made it my job to make sure that they don't experience any more hard things. They've experienced enough for a lifetime. And I said, I love your heart in this. I love your intention in this, but you're not doing them any favors, because here's the bottom line. It's harsh but true that your child's future professor, their future boss, their future spouse, they can't accommodate them. Their future boss doesn't care that they had trauma or that they had adversity as much as, it would be nice if they did. We are tasked with preparing our children to be able to live independently and interdependently, to contribute, right? We don't want them to need us long term. Our job is to raise them up so they don't need us. I mean, I want them to want to be around me when they're when I'm in my old age, but at the same time, I don't want to create a dependency. So part of my job is helping them to have the right perspective on the hard things they experience in life so that they understand it really doesn't define them. It does become a footnote for me to give them enough good, positive, healthy relationships and experiences and ways of thinking and resources so that they don't see their trauma, their adversity as the dominant factor in their life, but rather amongst the large constellation of all the different factors of their life, it's just one. It becomes that footnote, right? That jumping off point.
I think you're absolutely right. And again, we never look at it in terms of the things that we're taking away from them. We're looking at it in terms of the things that we think we're protecting them from. And there are legitimately things that you should protect your kids from. And then there's just some things that are uncomfortable that you need to let them experience. Like I think I told you last night, my son was he's 4, but he's kind of getting bullied a little bit by a rougher kid that's his age. But the thing is I never once thought to myself, I need to go intercede. Now, I wanted to kill the kid and beat his dad up and all the things. And guys, I'm being funny. But it's like you never want to see your kid going through pain. But he needs that, because if he sees me swoop in and say, hey, stop being mean to my boy, young man, give him some space, then my son's going to assume that anytime something bad's happening to him and making him uncomfortable, that dad's going to be there to protect him. But there's a little thing that I keep on the background of my phone, because maybe people will understand this. I can be a little bit aggressive. I can be a little bit default aggressive. And so the lion comes out a lot. But as it pertains to my wife and kid, I need to be lamb with them, lion for them. Right. And so, because the thing is if the kids don't know that the lion is available, they're going to be self-conscious. They're going to be anxious because they're like, if something bad happens, like I know some guys that are really, really, really soft. And if someone broke into the house, like they're going to be hiding behind their wives just because they're pathetic men. I love them, but they're pathetic. But like if the kids don't know that the lion's available, that's not a good situation. But if all they ever see is lion and they don't see lamb and they don't see the nurturing side, they're going to be anxious and like constantly ratchet it up. And so that's what I kind of have to remind myself. But you kind of get into this a little bit in the book when you talk about confounding variables. And so here's a quote from the book. It almost doesn't make sense. The facts that both early adversity is associated with negative outcomes largely, and that less commonly, highly successful people have experienced early adversity. This is true across the board. This is why when people talk about how the 1% is evil, it's like, you dope. The 1% changes all the time because most of the millionaires and billionaires that we see in modern day are self-made, which means they didn't get millions and billions inherited from mommy and daddy or grandma and grandpa, like the Rockefellers and all these types of things. A lot of these people are first generation. The richest man on the planet and the richest man ever, you know, in terms of what billions of dollars mean, is Elon Musk. His parents were not independently wealthy. Right? People are like, oh, well, he got a loan from his dad to start his first business. The loan was like $30,000. It's not nothing, but it's like, it wasn't like he was handed $1 billion. It's like, all right, son, don't mess up. And he turned it into 70 billion or whatever. But that is the interesting thing is I want to talk a little bit more and put a finer point on how, if you live in the suburbs, if you make a good living, if you have enough money to completely insulate your kid from any levels of discomfort, they're never going to be cold or hot, they're never going to be hungry, all those things. How can we infuse adversity into their lives? And I mean this practically, not philosophically. Yeah. How can we do those things? Because I always encourage parents, they've got to play sports. Don't pick them. And don't force them into one sport and make them specialize in golf or football or baseball from the age of 4 or something like that. But they've got to learn adversity in a team setting. They've got to want to quit at some point during the middle of the season. And you say, that's just too bad. Thompsons aren't quitters. And so if you want to never play again after the season, we can do that. But we don't quit in the middle of it. We're not going to quit on our teammates. But also, they need the individual side. They need wrestling. They need jujitsu. They need something like that to where it's like, I'm constantly getting killed by people that are better than me, but I'm better than all the people that aren't training, right? So how, maybe outside of the world of sports, can we make sure kids are in these situations that cause adversity?
Yeah, well, I think that, I want to cause stress, right? I want to cause stress for them. And I would say that I think athletics is a great place. I think anything that requires discipline, practice, evaluation. For example, our girls are dancers, and we chose a teacher, I guess, I'm thinking in Spanish here, who is very disciplined. She's very nurturing, but she will call you out and say, that wasn't good, do it again. Or she'll tell you, hey, you can't move up to the next level. I like that. I want that. Now, I get to be the nurturer on the back end where they're upset or they're sad. And, part of what we need to help them do, though, is there's so much that's modeling, right? So my daughter was upset that she was pulled from a particular dance a few years ago. And so we sit down and I said, okay, I'm not calling the Mies. I'm not going to do that. I said, what do you think you need to do? And she said, well, I'm not sure. And she said, I think I need to talk to her. Okay, well, what do you want to say? I'm coaching her. Part of how you can build resilience in your child is through coaching them through difficult things. So you're talking about your son. And you said, you're talking about the lion and the lamb. And part of your job then as the dad is to cultivate in your sons that same paradox, right? Those same characteristics so that they have the capacity to do that for their own families and their own circles of influence. And, I think that the tendency is to step in, like you said, you want to swoop in. But what does that tell your son? Hey, I don't think you can do it. That's the implicit message. And so instead, we're going to let our kids, we're not going to step in and fight for them for everything, right? We're going to let them learn how to do the practical skills of life, how to handle the relational sides of things. And guess what? They might mess it up. But I'd really rather that my 7-year-old messes up talking with her teacher at this age when it's like, oh yeah, she's 7, it's understandable, that I don't give her the ability to have these challenging experiences. And when she's 25, 30, 40, she's still calling me saying, Mom, be the snowplow parent for me. That is not going to happen. So I think it's giving more freedom, more leeway. When they're at the park and it's like little kids are taking risks and you're like wanting to say, be careful, be careful. You're letting them take risks. You're letting them learn what their capacity is, right? I think also, showing them what it looks like to persevere. We are very, very quick to give our kids an out. We're very quick, if we're not careful, to say, I want to make this easy for you. The ideas around success now are around things like, oh, I need to, I'm going to help you with your homework so that you can get good grades. That is not going to work well for your child long term, okay? Nope. Rather, we're going to sit alongside. We're going to support. We're going to, if it's 3 hours at the kitchen table, we're there. We're bringing tea. We're bringing snacks. But we're not saying, oh, you don't have to do this. Oh, we're going to talk to the teacher and make sure that you do less. I mean, there is a time and a place for accommodations, okay? There's a time and a place. Way overused, because what's going to happen is if you want your child to be successful in the workplace, to be successful academically long-term, they need to know how to do it. And so we're creating in them, we're helping them to know, hey, remember you did this last week. You can do it. The more they do, the more they can do. One example that we give is chores. I am a real big fan of chores. And sometimes I feel sorry for my kids, because when you're a child of a researcher who studied these different things, like, you're just not going to have a coddly little childhood. But I think they're going to be fine long term. I'm not going to worry too much about it. But, let's say you get a kid, you've got a kid in your family. And now I'm working a lot with foster and adoptive families, but this could be your biological family, right? And you're going to do chores with your kids. You've got a 10-year-old, and you say, hey, your responsibility is going to be dinner dishes. And this kid is like, excuse me, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so you have a choice. You can either be in a power struggle, which is just never going to go well, or you can come alongside and build their capacity. We're going to build scaffolding for them. So we're going to say, you know what? Good point. I'm going to wash and you're going to dry. And as you're doing that, you're building this bond with your child, right? And you do that for a few days. And as they build their capacity, you say, you know what? You're doing great. You're going to wash. I'm going to dry. You're building their capacity. And of course, you're saying like, hey, I think you're doing a great job. You're getting this. You're getting the hang of it. I'm going to go over here across the kitchen to the refrigerator. I'm going to organize the refrigerator tonight while you wash and dry. Look at that. Your kid is doing the chore. You didn't have a power struggle. You didn't destroy the relationship. But now, you're saying, hey, so-and-so is taking over this and he's doing a great job. You're making sure to brag a little bit about them. To, whoever. And all of a sudden, you, through just a few days, have maybe a few weeks, if you got a stubborn kid, have created that ability. And now when they say, oh, I don't know how to mow the lawn, you're like, oh, remember, we know how to do this. You're letting them understand that some of life is boring. Some of life isn't entertainment. Some of life is hard. And you just do the thing, even when you don't feel like it. We say in our family that feelings are indicators, not dictators. I'm not anti-feeling, but also we sometimes say like, don't always follow your heart. Sometimes your heart's a liar. So, your heart might say, I don't want to do the chore. I want to watch TV. That's not what we're going to do. What needs to be done right now is what needs to be done. And not just for today and not just to make it easier for mom, but for the entire family, the vision of our entire family, not just now, but for generations. So helping them to understand this is how you contribute to the much bigger story beyond yourself, I think is also valuable. I'll pause there.
Well, no, and Nicole, some guys have parents that have done that on accident for them, but you need to be doing it on purpose. So I'll use an accidental example. So my dad was like my biggest fan. He came to every practice, every game, but he wasn't, a guy that, spent a lot of time reading the Bible or at all. I never saw him work out, never saw him crack a book, any of those types of things. So a lot of the wisdom I got from him was more accidental. And so I was on a baseball team, and you could pick out parts of the starting lineup by the dad's businesses that had sponsored the team, and they were on the outfield panels. And I was like, I felt like I was getting looked over. I felt like I was getting passed over, and I was really, really mad about it. And my dad was like, well, looks like you're going to have to figure it out. Like I was expecting my dad to go talk to the coach, right? And my dad was going to go give the coach a piece of his mind and all that. And my dad never did it. So I was like, huh. And so there was a particular tournament where I was on this team and I think I was hitting sixth and I was normally like a 3 or 4 hole hitter. So those are very important positions. And so after the first game, I hit sixth. I go up to the coach, and again, I'm like a punk kid, right? But I tried to do it as respectfully as possible. I was like, "Hey, coach, I think I've been doing well. I've been going well in practice. I've been hitting well. I think I should be hitting higher in the lineup." And he kind of sits back, crosses his arms, is like, "Really? You think you should be hitting higher in the lineup?" I was like, "Yes, sir, I do." And he goes, "Okay, thanks for your input." The very next game, he puts me at leadoff. I've never hit leadoff in my entire life. I was more of a power hitter. Leadoff, you need contact, you need, speed, all those types of things. He put me at leadoff. Now, for the rest of the tournament, I was at leadoff, did very well in that position, and then we kind of got back to the normal schedule of things later on that week. But if I had thought this is my dad's responsibility to talk to coach, that's a different mindset. This is my dad's responsibility to earn me more playing time or to convince the coach with his wordsmithing that I should be getting more opportunities. Then I would always look at that as that's dad's responsibility. But it's kind of the same thing, Nicole, with modern day with my boys. Like I'm a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. I'm not terrible, but when he's in practice, I'm not his coach, right? His coaches are his coaches. Yes. And boy, I tell you, on the way to practice, I tell them, if you do not listen to your coaches, if you mess around while they're talking or something like that, oh boy, you will never get to come back. And those are the consequences. But you would think like, oh, Kyle, you might know more than the guy that's even teaching the class. That's not the point. I get to be dad. That guy only gets to be coach, right? Yes. That's a way better thing, right? Kind of the same thing with people that they want to be their kid's friend. It's like, bro, your kids are going to have friends that come in and out of their lives. Like I don't even talk to 3 of the 4 guys that were in my wedding at this point. Like, things just happen in life, but they get one dad. They get one dad. So just be dad. And so here, now I'm preaching. I need to get back to the book. Chapter 8 of the book. The title of the chapter is Relationships Build Resilience. Now, I would like to suggest a change to the chapter title. I think it should be Relationships That Challenge You Build Resilience. Because there are a lot of people that have relationships that are hard because they have sluggards or dumbards that are friends of theirs. And so, but they love them. And so that's my sluggard and that's my dumbard. And so you stay in this stupid, friendship with this moron because like you think that somehow you're going to fix them or help them. It's like missionary dating when a girl's like, I can fix him. It's like, he'll never be cleaner and more polite than when y'all are dating. So if he sucks now, he's going to suck worse later. But like in this exact scenario that we're in, relationships that challenge us on a regular basis, that's what builds resilience. We talk about a foxhole on this podcast all the time. Like, do you have guys that aren't that impressed by you? Do you have guys that are willing to interrupt you regardless of how much money you make and to tell you, hey, brother, what you said to your wife at dinner was kind of off color and I don't think she really appreciated it. And if you do it again in my presence, we're going to have issues and it's not just going to be words. Do you have guys like that are willing to put relational chips in the middle of the table and they're going to, risk hurting your feelings to make you better? Let's talk more about relationships that challenge us.
Yeah, well, we did a study of about 1,100 adults who have care experience. They've been in, orphanages, adoption, foster care, and we wanted to look at what helped them. So kids or adults that as kids had extreme adversity, right? We're like, what helps you to have resilience? What are the protective factors that most seem to be effective? And what we found is that more protective factors is more better. Okay. We want more equals more. Mm-hmm. But what we also discovered is there were certain protective factors that unlocked a whole bunch of other ones. And they always involved relationships. Okay. So they revolved around relationships. And I would say for kids, so going back to, you talking about being a dad in the role of that, like kids need mom and dad. I know that has somehow become a controversial thing to say in the West, but I'm just gonna say it out. Kids need mom and dad. Science shows definitively that moms and dads just bring really different things to the table, very complementary, very important, layered and interwoven things. But yes, I would say for everyone, we need those relationships, yes, that challenge us, that grow us, that help us to have everything we need to achieve our full potential. That's where, for kids, parents are so important. If you have a loving, engaged parent, you're going to have food, you're going to have shelter, you're going to have safety. Somebody's looking out for you, somebody's helping you to think about the future, somebody's helping you to see your identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Relationship with God. Absolutely key for those people who might be listening saying, hey, I am the kid who experienced trauma and I'm all grown up now and I don't have a mom or dad to come in and rescue me. I'm really sorry. That's really hard. That's really hard. And also, still, trauma does not define you. And God can come in and heal those wounds. He can, he heals the brokenhearted. He binds up their wounds. There's promises in scripture about this. And relationships are going to be an absolutely key factor. I can tell you this much. You will not heal from trauma by yourself. You will not overcome your early adversity by yourself. You will not get through hard things by yourself. We can do extremely difficult things, even for a long time, if we have the right people to go through them with us. Our relationships help us to be overcomers, except, like you're saying, if you have these kind of like enabling people around you, or people that are just going to say, oh yes, let us sit around and define ourselves by the difficult things in our lives, those relationships won't help you, right? But if you have the right relationships, if you have people that really are in it for your long-term good, if you have a relationship with the Lord who created you as an eternal soul in his image, like he's not giving up on you, okay? This is not a waste. If you have those things in your life, there is no limit of hope for overcoming.
Well, Nicole, one of the things I like to do, my style when I'm invited to go speak at a church or typically a men's conference is burn it down and walk away, because I don't live here, right? So if you invite me to Who's This What's It, Ohio, and I go in there, guess what? I don't live there, and so I don't have to deal with all the consequences of the things that I've said and all the stuff that I've burned off. But I tell guys all the time, I was like, what is this? Why have we colloquially agreed that men should kind of seek to be this lone wolf? It's like, have any of y'all watched the Nature Channel? What happens to lone wolves? They die alone, right? So they were typically an alpha, and then they aged out of the pack, and then they were dispelled from the pack and they died alone. They froze to death, they starved to death, or they were predated by another animal, okay? And so that's not a good thing. There's this guy online, and I follow him because I think there's a part of me that thinks he's awesome, but it's this old man. He looks like he's in his 70s because he's got a long white beard. He is tatted all the way up on his, his neck, on his knuckles, and he does these videos where he's in this garage, like it's like this little shop garage thing, and it's got stuff all over the place. He's got just enough space on the floor to deadlift. And this old man has like 600 pounds on the bar. He throws a sock in his mouth and he just grabs the bar, just, and then sets it down, and he says some sort of piffy thing to the camera, and then he moves on. That's what would happen to me if I didn't have a foxhole in the family, right? That's what I would do. I would be the guy with the long beard and the tattoos. I would just be deadlifting with a sock in my mouth. And as aspirational of an identity as that might be for some other people, I like the idea of having guys in my life that whenever I'm grabbing the bar, they're also grabbing the bar with me. Because guess what, guys? There are just some weights in this world that are too heavy for you to lift on your own. This lone wolf, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, American male, John Wayne BS. Like, John Wayne wasn't an actual tough guy. He was a tough guy on television. That guy had a bunch of people that made him look tough on screen. And here's the thing with you. You are going to run into a situation. It is going to be your dark night of the soul. It's going to be the valley of the shadow of death. And if you don't have guys that are ready and available to pick up that bar, you are screwed. And there are no two ways about it. But Nicole, we do actually have to bring this conversation to a close at some point because I don't have you for the rest of the day. But I want you to put a bow on this overall idea of overcoming, because yes, does this apply to adult males and adult females? Yes, all these things certainly apply. But there are so many guys, I told you this off air, that they're working on resilience for themselves, but then whenever you tell them, okay, now apply this to your kids, they look at you like you're speaking Mandarin. And so help guys practically think about this in a way to where, okay, I want resilient kids. I want kids that are overcomers. Here's how we do it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I would say firstly that if you're in a situation where you're caring for kids it is a high and holy calling, and sometimes something that we just like stuff into the margins of like, yeah, I'll get to that there. No, it is actually so impactful, and it's going to be impactful, whether impactful for good or for bad. You get to make that decision. I would say when thinking about building resilience in your children, I would argue that this is going to be one of the most pivotal investments you can make in your progeny. Okay. Like I said, this world is not about to get easier. And there are a lot of people right now that are thrown by challenges that are happening, just like devastated. We don't want that for our children. We want them to see the challenge, address the challenge, move through the challenge, and move on from the challenge. The challenge cannot define them. So thinking about how you're going to cultivate this within your family is going to be important. I would encourage you to choose probably 3 things. Choose a way that you're going to get your child involved in something that is going to challenge them physically. Choose a way that you're going to involve resilience in your relationship with them. Where are you going to cultivate that? Where are you going to challenge them, whether it's with chores, whether it's with climbing a mountain, whether it's with challenging with them with character habits? And then finally, I would encourage you to really think about how are you involving them in faith? I think that for me, understanding my relationship with God, which is an evolving process, right? Like no one ever arrives there. It's always evolving. I cannot imagine having gotten through some of the difficult things that I've gone through without knowing that I have a Heavenly Father that loves me, even when I don't feel like He's good or He's loving. I know from the truth of Scripture that He is. Knowing that, knowing He's on my side, knowing He has created me for eternity, having an eternal perspective, knowing that something that lasts for a year or 2 or 5 or 10 is a blink in the context of eternity, completely changes my perspective of my own suffering and the suffering of those around me. And I think that's a real gift that not only can we give to our children, we must give that gift to our children if we want them to be overcomers long term, and overcomers when they're not in our home with our hand to hold theirs. So those would be the things that I would say. And I would just say, listen, there is so much hope. There are countless ways to build resilience in your kids, but you must be strategic about how you're going to do that, which is why we wrote the book.
All right. Amen and amen. We've weaved in and out of a lot of different subject matters. I appreciate you being with us the whole way, but that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, thank you so much for having me here. It's been really fun.
Thank you, Nicole. There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed my time with Nicole. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So the only link I've got for you today is a link to where you can buy your copy of Overcoming. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.